Welcome to the guided workshop for Hands-on Labs 2246 on Cloud Foundation. My name is Phil Belfons, and I will be your presenter today. Just a little bit about me. I'm a staff solution architect at VMware, and that means I get to work with large customers, mostly in the SLED space, talking about Cloud Foundation and specifically around how it interacts with their VMware Cloud networking. So NSX and AVI and those different pieces. I've been with VMware for almost 8 years now this fall, and I'm married with 2 kids and live up in Wisconsin in the US. So enjoy the summers that's ending here and getting ready for the long winter. So Hands-on Labs been around for a few years. Just gonna go into a little bit of what went into constructing this lab. You're probably familiar with our Hands-on Lab program, but we put together a lot of different labs that showcase our different software and let you go in and actually test drive and use it. And these labs don't go together always the easiest. Sometimes it's a struggle because they're not running on physical hardware directly. They're running within a nested environment, meaning we've installed vSphere and then spun up another set of vSphere hosts on top of those hosts and then install their software there. So they're double, in the case of this lab, it's double nested, and it's in its 3rd layer of inception before it actually gets produced. And that has some different problems it creates. One of the biggest challenges for us is the slowness. So it creates a bit of lag in things happening, but it also has some other challenges around installing the software and just getting it to work the way it should work in the real world. So that means that it takes about 2 months to put together this lab, and it's a total of 11 virtual hosts. We were one of the largest labs. Now I think the Tanzu lab has actually taken that over and is slightly larger than us, but we're still one of the largest labs in the Hands-on Labs. And for that reason, there's not a whole lot of extra labs available. So what we do is we pre-populate these labs so that when you log in, you don't have to wait the 30 minutes for it to boot up. But that means you don't get to keep many of those running in standby for you. So if you do log in and get we're waiting, lab's not ready and you're waiting for it to be ready, that would be why. Depending on how many people hit the lab environment at a single time, you may get a cold lab. These labs are primarily used by customers to access and test out our software, but we do take this same lab and use it internally for demos and for training. And I've used it quite a few times for individual demos or guided demos where customers can go in and we can have a full session where they get to play with the software, but then ask questions and use it that way. So it's pretty good use of our time to set these up, and hope you enjoy going through this lab. We have 8 different lab modules this year for the VMware Cloud Foundation Lab. Primarily, they're all around the different use cases specific to the software-defined data center manager, SDDC manager, that is specific to VCF. If you're looking for labs that dive into things like NSX or vSphere or some of the other components that are within VCF, those can be found in other labs. This is going to go primarily into how Cloud Foundation itself is managed and operated. So just a quick overview of what those modules will be. We'll have a Cloud Foundation overview, and I'm actually going to go through that lab with you here at the very beginning. And then there's time for you to use user interface exploration, kind of see what how a CDC manager is laid out, see all the different components it has. Then we have an automated workload domain deployment. This is an ISIM, meaning that it's a pre-recorded lab. The actual deployment of a workload domain can take upwards of 45 to 90 minutes, depending on the hardware. And in our environment, it can take 2 or 3 hours because of, as I mentioned before, being double nested. So that takes a long time if you were to sit through and just watch the wheel spin. So we've recorded that as an ISIM, allows you to just click through it. You see all the same information, but makes it a little faster for you so you can get through that lab in about 15 minutes instead of 3 hours. which is what it might take in our environment. Then we'll go through module 4, lifecycle management. I'm going to dive into that one a little bit deeper here as well, because I think that's probably one of the most sought after components of Cloud Foundation is how am I going to lifecycle all these different pieces now that I own vSphere and NSX and vSAN? How do I bring it all together and lifecycle it? So we're going to go through that. And then module 5 is around workload domain operations, talking about expanding and building out workload domains and clusters. And then we get into some of the more operational pieces of VCF around certificate management, role-based access control and password management, and then finally removing hosts and clusters. So we built all this out, but now you're going to take this workload domain and use it for something else. You can run through that and that removing hosts and clusters. So that's how the lab's constructed. So now let's dive into kind of what is Cloud Foundation. So Cloud Foundation really is the platform for running your private data center. So we build out Cloud Foundation is a construction of all of our different products. It brings together management, compute, storage, and networking into a single platform that's easy to deploy, but then is also consistent across all of your private data center, our public cloud, out to the edge. It can be one consistent platform for running your environment. We do that through a standardized architecture. So VCF brings together a standardized way to deploy all these different products so that we know that they're going to work together in the best way possible. And one of the neat things that has happened over the last few years is we brought the VMware Validated Designs, which has been a large document of our best practices for deploying a VMware infrastructure together with VCF. So that's one set of documents that is Cloud Foundation and our VMware Validated Designs. So those have come together and merged. It's a full stack approach. As I mentioned, it brings together all of our products. So we're not just looking at individual pieces and what's best for those, but we're taking a full stack approach, which gives you a more integrated full solution than just the single product. It's tested and validated. We go through pretty extensive testing to verify these products work together in the way that we think they will when we deploy them using this architecture to meet our use cases like disaster recovery, expandable infrastructure, different types of use cases that we're specifically testing for. And this platform becomes the primary place to run apps and services and provide automation for the rest of your infrastructure through this. And that all comes through a simplified experience. And then, of course, security is built into the entire platform so we can ensure that what we're deploying meets the security requirements of businesses. So Cloud Foundation starts with an initial deployment. Before we can deploy or start using Cloud Foundation, we have to deploy it on something. It's not a brownfield type of deployment where I can take hosts that have already been configured and set up and you're running vCenter and everything and bring them into Cloud Foundation. Cloud Foundation is greenfield, meaning that I have to deploy it all from the base up. So I start with 4 fresh hosts that have nothing on them except for ESXi, and I connect them to my network. So pretty basic deployment. The ESXi version we load is whatever version is compatible with the version of VCF you're deploying. So if you're deploying 4.2, you find the build number for vSphere, and that's the vSphere version you'll deploy on those hosts. Then we go through and we fill out a deployment checklist. It's an Excel spreadsheet that has all of the information for IPs, host names, DNS servers, NTP, licensing. All that information is put together in this deployment checklist. It's got usernames and passwords, everything we need for the full deployment. All the stuff you'd need anyway if you're deploying 4 nodes to create a cluster, but we're just bringing it all together in one spot. Once we've got that deployment checklist created, we then deploy a deployment appliance. It's called Cloud Builder, and it's a simple OVA file you download. You can run it on your laptop or on a 5th machine within the data center that has access to these 4 hosts. And that virtual appliance is what's going to do all the heavy lifting of building this infrastructure. Then we take that Excel spreadsheet and we import it into this Cloud Builder appliance. It does some checks and scans of the of that checklist, and we'll go through and build out those 4 hosts. And once those 4 hosts are done, this process takes anywhere from 60 minutes to 2 hours to run through, depending on your host hardware and the configuration and everything. Once you're all done, you'll have a management domain. And that management domain is those 4 hosts running SDDC Manager, which is the brains behind VMware Cloud Foundation, vCenter Server, and NSX Manager. So it's running the full set of the full NSX suite, and all this is built on vSAN. So the management domain is always built using vSAN. So we'll have, that's our storage type here. And so all of these the whole management domain is built and has all of our components in it. So let's look a little closer at what a management domain is. It's a purpose-built domain specifically for running the management components of your data center. And so we require 4 hosts. Those of you familiar with vSAN will understand why. Basically what it comes down to is if we have 4 hosts, we can take 1 out for maintenance. And if we have any sort of failure within the other 3 hosts, we're not going to lose any data. We can ensure availability of that environment. If we were to go down to 3 hosts and we took 1 out for maintenance and then had a hard disk fail, we'd run the chance of potentially the cluster going down, most likely, and then potentially losing hardware or losing data as well, which would not be a good management domain if we had any of that happen. So that's why we require those 4 nodes for that environment. And then within the environment, we've installed SDDC Manager, vCenter, and NSX components. Optionally, we can also deploy the vRealize suite. Through the vRealize suite lifecycle manager, we can deploy VROps, Log Insight, Verni, all those different optional components can run in there as well. And then finally, you can put optional customer workloads in there. So if you need to run a backup server or a DNS server, Active Directory servers, anything that's goes into the management of your domain, you can run that in that environment. We wouldn't suggest putting things that you want to ensure are or things that you'd want to run in a workload domain that are separate, that are customer facing, are generally not what you want to put in here. You'd want to keep this to be more of your management side. But we do have a scenario called a consolidated architecture where you can put any type of workload in the management domain and start small with just 4 nodes and then expand that out as you grow. So I mentioned this concept of a workload domain. The workload domain is where we would build out and put all of our different workloads that are more customer or business facing. And so we take an additional 4 nodes running vSAN, and we build out a workload domain. And a workload domain has its own vCenter and its own NSX manager. The first workload domain will have its own NSX components. From there, then we can continue to expand and deploy virtual machines into this environment. And then if we want to add a second workload domain, we can. Maybe the first one is for our general purpose compute, and the second one will be for virtual desktops. We can build that out. We get another vCenter. So now we're up to 3 total vCenters. We've got 1 for management, 1 for workload domain 1, and 1 for workload domain 2. And then we can deploy our apps within there. And optionally, if we want, we can either deploy another set of NSX managers for that second workload domain, or we can share the NSX components between the 2 workload domains. As far as NSX edges are the north-south routing that will happen from NSX. So the NSX workloads can get in and out of the virtual network of NSX. Those NSX edges will live in the management domain for the management domain components, and then you'll have optionally in the workload domains you can run NSX edges as well. So place those there as needed. And so Cloud Foundation provides, as you can see, this standardized way of deploying a VMware infrastructure that's automated. It has simplified scaling. I can add workload domains, remove workload domains very easily. and gives me full lifecycle management of the environment. And we'll go deeper into lifecycle management here in a minute. First, I want to talk a little bit more about automation and scale. So we can easily scale out this environment and add additional hosts, additional clusters, workload domains, and NSX edges. So we'll run through those scenarios real quick here. Within VMware Cloud Foundation, we have this idea of host commissioning, where we take a host that has vSphere installed and we commission it to SDDC Manager. So we verify that it's got the right versions. We once it gets commissioned into SDDC Manager, we verify that it can reach the storage, that it's got the IPs correctly configured, and we put a fingerprint on it. We confirm the fingerprint of the vSphere host. And so once we understand all of that, then it becomes available to be consumed then within SDDC Manager. So now we can use it to add to a workload domain or add to a cluster, or really those are the two options there. So from a management domain, then if I go in and I say create a workload domain, it's going to create a new vCenter server. It's going to, I get a choice of whether I want to use VLCM baselines or images, what kind of storage I want to use. So vSAN is what I've primarily talked about up to this point, but you also have the option for workload domains to be vVol, NFS, or VMFS on Fiber Channel. So you do have some additional storage options when you build out a workload domain. Then you select your host that you want to put in. These are the hosts that we commissioned in the previous step. And then I choose my network fabric. Do I want to create a new NSX environment, or do I want to use the existing NSX environment? So I go through all of that, and then Cloud Foundation will go through the inventory and spin up that workload domain for consumption. And it automates over 50 manual steps. So all things you would go through if you're going to add additional hosts, create a new cluster, a new workload domain in your environment manually, it's going to automate all of that and verify that you can do it quickly and consistently. So now, if we have a workload domain, originally when you build a workload domain, it only has one cluster. If I want to add additional capacity, I could add additional hosts to that workload domain cluster, or I could add another cluster. And so if I want to spin up additional clusters within that environment, I'd say create a cluster. I then configure I choose which workload domain I want to add my cluster to. It uses the update manager configured with that domain. So in the workload domain configuration, we chose, say, baseline. We can then use that same baseline for all clusters within a workload domain. Within each cluster, we can choose what type of storage. So we don't have to use the same type of storage across all workload domains, but each cluster can have its own set of storage. So we choose the storage for it, select the host that we commissioned previously, and then it will automatically use the network fabric configured for that domain. So if that workload domain has its own set of NSX edges and its own NSX instance, it will then use that NSX instance. If it's sharing between other workload domains, it'll use that shared instance. So that is consistent across all clusters within a workload domain. So once we fill out that wizard, it will run through and build out our second cluster where we can place applications. And then finally, we can scale an existing cluster. So if we want to add hosts to an existing cluster, go through a very similar process. We've commissioned the host. We choose where we want to place it, what cluster, which workload domain, and then it will use the network fabric that is associated with that workload domain and do all the configuration for it. We add a host to this cluster and expand it out. So then there's one final type of expansion or scaling that we can do, and that's create an NSX edge cluster. This NSX edge cluster is used for that north-south traffic to get out of NSX, helps with routing. We can place load balancers and firewalls in here. And so we can add an edge cluster, and that we go through and we create the go through the optional workflow to deploy an NSXT edge cluster. And then we provision our tier 0 logical edge, configure our layer 3 adjacencies, and then choose our form factor. How large do we want it? And then do we want it to be active-active or active standby? So availability options. Once we go through and fill out all of the information there, again, it will automate and deploy additional NSX edges for the clusters. So that's the expansion lifecycle. So finally, we're going to go through lifecycle management. So this is module 4. If you only have time to go through one module, this would be the module I would run through. Understanding how Cloud Foundation can make it easier to upgrade and manage your environment is a huge value I find that most customers are looking for, is how can I automate managing and upgrading, staying consistent with patches and everything in my VMware environment. So what we start with each Cloud Foundation environment is a bill of materials. So every time we come out with a new release, and this is in this case, it's 4.3, we create a bill of materials. And this is a list of products that we've tested and that are built together to work within Cloud Foundation. So you can see here, we've got SDDC Manager 4.3, we got vSphere 7.0 update 2A, and then vSAN 7.0 up to 2A as well, and NSXT 3.1.3, and then all of our vRealize Suite components. So we create this bill of materials that says these products have been tested and work together, and this is what will be our Cloud Foundation 4.3 releases, this bill of materials. And so we go through and we test all the dependencies, verify the upgrade order of things. So when Cloud Foundation does its updates, basically you're going to get notified that says, hey, there's an update available. Do you want to download it? Then Cloud Foundation, you'll download that updated bundle. And sometimes it's one bundle to do the upgrade. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 bundles. So it kind of depends on the upgrade process and what's being upgraded in each different version. So like a 4.3.1 may only upgrade vCenter, and it doesn't do anything to the host or to NSX or any of that. So there might only be one update. In other cases, if it's upgrading everything, if you're going from 4.0 to 4.3, you might have to download all of the different bundles. So you might need vCenter, ESXi, and NSX, and all these different pieces but with Cloud Foundation, it brings all that into one place and it puts it always in the correct order. So we know that when we get that upgrade bundle, it's going to say, do you want to apply this? And you only have one available at any given time. You'll say, apply that. Once that one's done, you'll get another pop-up says, hey, there's another upgrade available. And they'll take you to the next step of that upgrade. And you'll go through the iteration to get to the next level. So it simplifies the consistency. A lot of people like to say one button upgrades. It's not really a one button in that I push it once. It's one button in that I might push it 4 or 5 times, but I get to my upgrade consistently and through that process. So Cloud Foundation will handle all of that. So once it says, hey, I've got a new upgrade available, you select to download that bundle. Then you run through what we call pre-check process. And pre-check goes through and verifies the versions that are installed are actually what SDDC Manager thinks is installed, and nobody's done any upgrades to the back end. It verifies that all the passwords are working correctly, verifies that there's space for the upgrades. We've all been through that when we try to go through an upgrade and, oh, I don't have enough space. So it's going to verify that you have enough storage available. It's going to verify your hardware meets the requirements for the next version. If you're upgrading vSAN, you got to make sure all of that hardware is still on the hardware compatibility list. So it's going to verify all of these things for you to make sure that your upgrade is going to be successful. And best chances are that if all of those come back clean, you're ready for a good upgrade. It's also going to verify the backups and all of that. So once I've gone through and done my pre-check, my system comes back clean, it's ready for an upgrade. I then hit I can either then update now, which will trigger that upgrade to happen immediately, or I can upgrade at a scheduled time. So I could say, oh, upgrade in tonight at midnight or whatever the time is. At that time, it'll go through and go through the upgrade of whatever component is upgrading. When it's done, it will then notify you that it's completed. A couple other pieces there. When it does do an upgrade, if it's upgrading a workload domain or cluster, it will lock you out of making any other workload domain changes. So I can't add a workload domain at the same time that I'm patching another workload domain, just because there might cause a problem there. And so we lock users out of making certain changes during those times so that we don't have any problems with the upgrade process. So that's one value you get from VCF, is it'll ensure that people aren't doing things that could cause problems with that upgrade at the same time. And then once the upgrade is complete, we'll give you a report that says, here's what was upgraded, here's the current versions of what's deployed now. And so all the components within SDDC Manager get upgraded through the SDDC Manager. So we've got vSphere, vSAN, NSX, vCenter, and then the whole vRealize suite. And the interesting thing with the vRealize suite, when we do the upgrade there, is it actually hands off to the vRealize suite lifecycle manager to do with the upgrade of those components. But it's all still handled through SDDC Manager, so you only have one place to go to get all of your upgrades. So that's what I had to discuss today. I appreciate you guys taking the time and going through this lab. I hope you find it useful and get a chance to play with Cloud Foundation and see how it can fit into your environment.